Hi, just a disclaimer here, this video was not intended to be exhaustive because the subject matter certainly would lend itself to a much longer video. So it's not intended to be exhaustive, it's just skimming the surface and some of my basic views on this. The subject is the British Empire. Now recently I've been thinking about Rome and in antiquity Rome was a superpower, there's no question about that. Um, and So I was thinking about that. It's sort of, I guess, coincidental, not directly linked, but at the height of Victoriana, there was a lot of kind of nods to Roman hegemony and Roman power. It was echoed in architecture and in in busts of great statesmen of that period, not just in the Victorian period. Actually, we can include the 18th century there. Um, the prominent historian and writer Sathnam Sanghera, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, is well known as a critic of the British Empire. He's a well published author. Anyway, there was a piece on the fact that he has called for the OBE, the E of OBE, Order of the British Empire, to be scrapped and replaced with excellence. Now, we live in a democracy. There should be debate on pretty much every issue, I think. That's healthy in a democracy. But I don't agree with it because I think it is part of a trend from the left to just try and, for want of a better term, flagellate this country in guilt. I just don't think it's the right way forward. Um, my take on the empire, I hope, is objective. I'm by no means a sort of dewy-eyed utopian, like looking back and say it was all good and we should, sing Rule Britannia every turn. It's not like that. But I do think that what I noticed was quite a lot of pushback against that suggestion. The comments were predominantly against it. And I think it's because a lot of British people feel, and not necessarily hard right people, just broadly a lot of people feel a little bit tired of this sense that we should feel bad about our history. Now, I don't say that we should hide our history. I don't say that we should whitewash the darker aspects of our history, but I think that it needs to be simply balanced. That's all. And in a way, you have two extremes. You have those who, I guess some of them are on the reactionary right, where they don't want to talk about any of the negative and they want to say it's all positive, or at least they only want to focus on the positive. And they do get a little bit sensitive and reactionary to any mere suggestion of even discussion of these things. I think that's wrong. There were some terrible things done in the name of British imperialism. That we can't deny that. I mean, there's no justification for Amritsar or some of the policies in Ireland, or you can name numerous other things that the British Empire done. But I would also point out that Britain made the modern world. The spread of the English language, the Westminster system of government, the creation of many institutions, universities, railways. Um, I think it's a bit of a lazy argument to say, oh, well, it would have happened anyway. The point is, it didn't. That was a direct result of British imperialism. Um, I've been reading on and off. I'm a very slow reader, but this excellent book by Neil Ferguson, Empire, 2003. Now, to be fair, he's probably more on the conservative side of things, hence you would expect him to be. Some people would just assume, okay, he's just going to defend the empire. Not necessarily so. Rather, what Ferguson does is seeks to explain why Britain got to the position it was. We actually came later, for example, than the Spanish, who had been the superpower of arguably the 17th century. Um, a lot of it is about contrasting how the British got to imperial hegemony over other European powers. The Dutch, the French, the Spanish, they all had sizable empires at different points, but none came close to the British. And that's not boasting, that is just a fact. No empire in human history has been as big as the British Empire in terms of overall territory. I think it was something like 36 million square kilometres. The second was the Mongol Empire, about 33 million kilometres squared at its peak. That was the largest contiguous empire, but in terms of overall area, none came close to the British. The problem I have with historians like Sanghera is they just want to focus on the negative, and I do think that, whilst not dishonest, engages in a sort of lack of balance and a lack of saying that this is something that was so dominant, but we're just going to look at the negative. It was all terrible and we should feel ashamed of it. I have a problem with that. I mean, for one thing, we often hear, for instance, about, and I'm not going to digress into every single aspect of the empire, but to look at India as a prominent example, we often hear Indian nationalists talk about, the Indians kicked the British out, there was a war of independence, etc. The important thing to remember is before the British, India was not a unified country. I've seen these lazy memes saying India before the British was the richest country on earth. Well, it wasn't a country. It was a collection of smaller kingdoms, princely states. Um, Indeed, today, Hindu supremacist Narendra Modi wants to gloss over India's rich Muslim history, although some of that was also drenched in blood, it has to be said. The Mughals weren't exactly peaceful in their conquest of India. Um, but the point I'm making there is it's a fallacy to say that before the British, India was this happy, unified land. It wasn't. And it's the same argument actually for when we talk about Native Americans as if they're one group. There's over 500 Native American groups, and many of them never even met one another. So to talk about it in terms of a country being invaded is misleading. We did exploit, we did some very cruel things, and we were arrogant, and all the rest of it. That's true. But all I'm saying is we need to have an objective view of this. And I think replacing, pretending it never existed is wrong. Am I ashamed of the fact that we were once the world's most powerful country, the global superpower in the 19th century? Frankly, no, I'm not. Do I acknowledge there was bad things? Yes, I do. And I don't think that's incompatible. Um, so, I don't look at it as we should be, boasting necessarily or talking about it in terms of pretending that bad things didn't happen. But the problem with the left, or I should say a segment of the left, is they simply want to vilify our history. And it's not just empire. They actually want to expand that across the board. I will be looking closely at Labour, what they're planning to do in the curriculum, because if it's about, tell children the British colonized the world and they were evil and oppressive, and, that is not going to be balanced. Yes, talk about the bad things, but talk about it across the board. In this great country, we have statues of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, there's not many other imperial powers that would have statues of the very people that rose against them. Think about that. Um, I do think this is a great country. We have flaws, but this idea that and something seems to be thrown uniquely at Western countries, you know, this is going to be in my next video regarding nationalism versus patriotism. But why is it that there is this unique focus on guilt with Western countries? And a similar thing in other European countries, there's these sort of debates that go on. Um, the Spanish have had it, the French have had it. But why is it uniquely aimed at Western countries? You know, um, Most powers, in some point, certainly China's had periods of hegemony. Um, there is this idea that in the West we should somehow be ashamed of our history, yet when it's seen in other parts of the world, it's seen as a positive thing. It's seen as mainstream. Um, so I'll be watching what Labour does. I hope they don't go into the territory of trying to just encourage children to feel ashamed of our history. It should be balanced. It should look at the whole picture. I agree that an honest nation looks at the negative sides of its past. I have no problem with all of that being discussed. But if we look at the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, what those who call for the slavery reparations ignore is that for most of the 19th century, the Royal Navy actively patrolled slavery operations. We freed slaves, and actually a large part of the national economy was spent in the abolition acts. I don't know what sort of percentage, but the call for reparations, I think, is misplaced. Also, this country gives a significant amount in foreign aid. I'm not saying that equates to making up for imperial wrongs, but it is a fact. Um, at what point do you start to say the third, fourth, fifth generations start to benefit? I mean, if we look at the former empire, if all former colonies were impoverished, then there might be an argument that the British made it that way, but there is a big discrepancy between them. Look at Singapore, it's one of the richest countries in the world. Contrast that to some parts of the Caribbean, which are quite poor. So, I don't think it's good enough to say that the British just created all the problems of today. Um, Also, I would point out that when a country becomes independent, that's responsibility. So I take a dim view of Indian nationalists who still want to vilify the British 75 years on from independence. Incidentally, they ignore some of the things that have happened in post independence India, such as Operation Blue Star, which killed thousands of Sikhs in 1984. I'm going to conclude this. I recommend this book, 2003, so it is a while back now. I probably should read more recent text, but I think Ferguson makes compelling arguments. He's not glorifying empire. He talks about the slave trade. He doesn't gloss over that stuff. Um, but it's just important to understand it objectively, because if it was all evil and all terrible and all cruel, then there's no way it would have lasted for over 200 years in the Indian subcontinent. We would have just been thrown out. There would have been sheer disgust. We would have been thrown out with hatred. You know, the fact that it lasts us so long is testament in itself. The fact 100,000 British civil servants controlled, 300 million Indians at the time, um, is a testament to how that was structured. Um, anyway, I'll wrap this up. There's probably many, many more things to say. I'm not an empire apologist, but I do not go along with those on the left who want to constantly flagellate this country and feel that we should approach it by collective guilt. I think that is wrong. I think we need to look at the whole picture. There was good and bad. That's the reality. There was good and bad.